And joining me now to talk about all this in his first TV News interview since ending his campaign is Senator Bernie Sanders. Senator, first, I thought maybe you could take us through your thinking here, what your conversations with staff were, what they were with the Biden campaign. There was reporting that you even talked to former President Barack Obama about how and why you came to the decision you did.
Look, there were two trends of thought among my key supporters. Number one, Bernie, look at the arithmetic. You're 300 delegates down. No way that you can come up with the kind of delegates you need for the convention. Get out. The other line of thought was, look, we got to keep fighting. We got to keep our issues out in the fall. We got to fight for Medicare for all. We got to deal with climate change. We got to make public colleges and universities tuition free. Keep those issues in the forefront. But I think what finally shaped my decision was the reality that as a United States Senator, I have got to deal with this unprecedented crisis that our country is facing in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the fact that now at least 17 million people have lost their jobs. So I want to play as good a role, as strong a role as I can in protecting the working people of this country during the economic collapse and doing everything I can to make sure that all of our people have the health care that they need right now. So those are some of the factors.
Just to sort of confirm the reporting, have you talked to President Obama during this period of time?
Yes.
What have those conversations been like?
Well, they're private conversations, Chris.
Well, can I ask about your conversations with Vice President Biden?
Yes. Oh,
how have those been?
Yeah. Look, I'll give you a better answer, a more detailed answer. Look, Joe Biden is a good politician, and his people are very smart. And they understand that in order to beat somebody like Trump, they're going to have to generate a lot of excitement, a lot of energy, and reach out to people who have not necessarily been all that supportive of the vice president. And that means a lot of younger people, a lot of lower income people. And I think what you have begun to see and will continue to see is that the vice president is listening to many of the concerns that low income people and working people and young people have, and beginning to move in their direction. He is now on board in making public colleges and universities tuition free for folks who are under $125,000 a year. He's now on board in canceling student debt for those who have been at public colleges and universities and HBCUs. I would have gone, obviously, a lot further today, but that is a movement in the right direction. Not far enough to my mind, but it is a movement, an important movement. Today, he announced that he would support reducing the eligibility age for Medicare from 65 down to 60. Again, a step in the right direction. There are a whole lot of millions and millions of people, 62, 64 years of age, who desperately want to get into Medicare. They will be able to do it. Again, I believe, needless to say, that we should move toward a Medicare for all program for all of our people. And that if there's anything this crisis is now showing us is the weakness of the employer-based healthcare system, because when millions of people are losing their jobs, right, they're not only losing their income, they're losing their healthcare as well. But I think what you will see is the vice president beginning to move in a more progressive direction.
All of those announcements were coming the last few days, and clearly, I think the subtext, or even just the text of them, right, is about sort of making overtures to folks in your camp. I want to sort of present to you an interpretation of events that I have seen people offer and get your response to it, which is basically, I've seen people say basically, you have a good personal relationship with Joe Biden, and that personal relationship is better than the personal relationship you had with Hillary Clinton in 2016. And that's a key driver for your decision making in 2020 as opposed to 2016, and what you would say to people that make that argument.
Well, I don't want to go back to 2016. You know, I'm not a great fan, as you well know, Chris, of political gossip. I have known Joe Biden for a number of years. Got to know him in 2006 when I entered the Senate, worked with him on a number of issues when he was vice president. I like Joe. I respect him. I think he's a very decent and honest guy. And I think we can work together. But I think the trick here is for him to develop an agenda that will respond to the unprecedented crisis that we are in right now. I think with 17 million people losing their jobs in the last 3 weeks, and by the way, the number is much greater than that, people losing their health care, people unable to pay their rent, people want bold ideas. They want a government that is prepared to stand up for working people in a way we have not seen for a long time.
You know, that you say bold ideas, and I've been thinking a lot about this. I was just having a conversation in the last block of the program about it. But, you know, covering very closely this campaign, you know, throughout my political life, there are certain moments where the rules of how will you pay for it seem to get suspended, like the Iraq War, the multi-trillion-dollar investment in Afghanistan over 18 or 19 years. And then there's other times where how you pay for it is this cudgel that gets wielded. And I wonder what, as you are watching this extraordinary period, and I think we would both agree, and most people agree, that the government needs to take extraordinary action to spend money, but just what you make of this moment ideologically to see so many Republicans, you know, wanting to shovel more and more money out the door.
Look, Donald Trump is a guy who has absolutely no ideology. In fact, I just heard, I don't know if it's, you know, with Trump, you never know what's true. We never know what's real or not. But he just said he wants to waive student debt for the next 6 months. You're hearing it first right here. He may not call it Medicare for all. I would not drop dead if in one form or another, Donald Trump got up and said, you know, we're in a terrible crisis. People can't afford their health care bills. I think we should guarantee health care to all people. He does not have any ideology. His goal, his only goal is to win, to enrich his friends. He will say and do anything to do that. And I think what the Democrats have got to do is not come up with their 83-point programs, which they often do, but be simple, straightforward, represent the working families of this country, and let the people know which side they are on.
The final question for you is one of the things, you know, there are these competing metrics I think people use to evaluate candidates. One's sort of ideology, and one's like technocratic competence, for lack of, how good an administrator they are. And having watched Trump up close in terms of the stakes of management of the U.S. government, I think a lot of people feel like they are seeing that in the highest relief they've seen in a while. And whether you feel the same way when you think about just the enterprise of who's running the American state and the stakes of that as we watch this pandemic unfold.
Absolutely. The incompetence is frightening. This is a president in the midst of a healthcare crisis gets up and says anything that comes to his mind, whether it has any scientific basis or not. Thousands of people will have died because he delayed and minimized the crisis that we were facing and downplayed it. So the incompetence is, to my mind, extraordinary. And I think what we have got to do in the Congress right now is be absolutely as clear as we can be. The Defense Production Act has got to be used in a vigorous way. We have got to provide health care to all of our people during this crisis. I happen to believe that what the best approach economically is to make sure that everybody continues to have their paycheck, continue paychecks, and subsidize employers in that respect. I think that's the cleanest, easiest way to protect working people in this country. But we need bold ideas now, not 87-point programs.
Senator Bernie Sanders, just if I can editorialize for one moment, I saw news today about how your campaign will be paying the health care of all the people that you employ in the campaign through, I think, the next 6 months. And I just want to say that it's a deeply decent thing to do. And I'm glad you're doing it. And thank you for taking some time with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Chris.